So we're continuing our way through. Obviously, we're on to the famous sign of Jonah, but I've put in brackets underneath and family and fiends rather than friends, because actually the passage we're looking at, we've got 12 verses that we're going to be looking at. We have the Jesus addressing that issue of the sign of Jonah, which we'll think about. Then we also have the issue of some dynamics around the demonic, and we want to put that into the context of why Matthew's put it where he has. So I've got the fiends there, and then we finish with Jesus's family, and what is often missed, but is a surprisingly there's a surprising little kind of hidden nugget in Jesus' affirmation of who is his family, but we'll get there at the end. So those are the verses we're looking at. I did think about whether to break them into two, but I figured we'll be still here in 2030, kind of working our way through Matthew at this kind of rate. So let's go on. So Matthew 12, verse 38. So then, yeah, okay. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees responding, saying, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." Now, to give some kind of context, I've touched on this before. Matthew is very loose with being kind of strictly chronological in terms of location and timings. It's to do with the agenda. It's been noted right from the days of the early church that Matthew has actually put his gospel together in a thematic way. It's an extremely apparently there's not sufficient disk space to keep recording. Let me just So let me start all over again. So we've got these verses then. So then some of the scribes and Pharisees responded, saying, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." Okay. Yeah, as I say, Matthew has been recognised right from the days of the early church as being put together thematically for being a kind of, if you like, a discipleship manual. So he tends to group things thematically, which means sometimes they're out of order if you compare them with the other gospels. On the flip side, it's not that any one gospel is the definitive order. It's just actually as you try to merge them together, you recognize their different agendas. And so actually there's probably a change of location, which therefore also implies a gap of time as well. But at this point in verse 38, and you can see that Matthew uses this as a joining phrase, the word then, regularly. And it's not that in Greek or in Hebrew then doesn't mean the next thing kind of chronologically, but from a kind of a literary point of view, you often find in the Old Testament, for instance, that the Hebrew equivalent of the Greek word then is used more to connect events in a world that was less dominated by clocks and times and so on. It's saying there was this and somehow this proceeded from it. So really when Matthew's using then, he uses it more than all of the other Gospels put together. He's using it in that very kind of ancient Aramaic, Hebrewish kind of a way, which is this sort of proceeds out of this rather than this happened and then immediately that happened. It joins them together in those ways. Now, the reason I say that is because chapter 13 starts with Jesus up in Galilee, but we started this run of events, if you remember, in Matthew 12 with the walking through the grain fields, and we saw as we put that together with Luke that this happens just outside Jerusalem. It can't be further away because there's not time because of the Sabbaths that surround it to have gone from the Passover feast and to have got out and back up to Galilee. So chapter 13 starts in Galilee, but actually it ties it down very much that it's at that same time, i.e. the things we're just going to talk about now. So at some point in Matthew 12 there is a shift of location and therefore a bit of a shift of a time, even though what he's talking about is still part of the same kind of a flow. So we then read, so then some of the scribes and the Pharisees responding, saying, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." But he replied to them, "It's an evil and adulterous generation that seeks after a sign." And we get this kind of general theme a couple of times in Jesus's words, which is, we often look at, and we're very keen on the things that to us kind of visually or quite stunningly kind of prove to us the presence of God. And Jesus often kind of pushes people to try and see things at actually a much more kind of human level. For instance, he says, you search the scriptures because you think that in them is life, but these things speak of me. So he's saying to the Jewish rabbis, without the guidance of the Holy Spirit, Oh, I'm getting another message. I think today we're going to have to live with the fact we're not going to have a good recording of this. um, and I will have to find out why I keep running out of space when we get there. So anyway, so an evil and adulterous generation seeks after sign. Yeah, sorry. I've just lost my train of thought. Oh, yeah, yes, yeah, that's right. So he's saying even without the guidance of the Holy Spirit, you should have been able to see something about this new thing that God is doing, which doesn't kind of fit your standard way of reading it. But that's not the case. There's something in your humanity should be able to recognize what is right and what is wrong. And we've had that as we've kind of gone through Matthew. These don't you understand? You know that your traditions. Well, it doesn't use the word traditions at that point, but that the law doesn't preclude you from doing good. You know that there's a very basic human level of kind of the moral instinct which Jesus is challenging, saying that should be sufficient. It should be sufficient to get you there. And here in this context, you're looking for a sign when in actual fact there is a sign all over the place. You've just seen someone get delivered of demonic spirit. Before that, you saw someone with a withered arm, but you're still looking for the bigger thing, the bigger proof. And there is a kind of a limit to which we can actually say that that's a beneficial thing. It should be sufficient just to see the fruit, which has been part of the conversation just before. You know a tree by its fruit. And it's a very challenging thing to take on board because we regularly see things where there can seem to be good fruit in the short term, but sometimes it takes a bit longer, and then you discover it wasn't good fruit. So it's not that it's and always for us, our conscience doesn't always tell us exactly correctly, but that there is a challenge, which is to kind of think it through carefully, to try and understand where something is going. Is this likely to sustain itself, and so on and so forth? And within that context, to be challenged if we see that suddenly God seems to be blessing something that we don't think he should. It's not really a let off, if I can put it that way. We need the Spirit as well to guide us. We need to bring discernment into the mix. But sometimes the form is not enough for us to dismiss something. It's not. We've always got to ask the question: what's the fruit coming through in this kind of a question? So it's an evil and adulterous generation that won't take it because it doesn't fit the form. Think of it like that. And then Jesus throws out this kind of casual comment, which is done in lots of good drama nowadays. But here's Jesus doing it in a very natural sense, which is when you sow you sow a little kind of what they call them an Easter egg now. You pop something in which seems trivial at the time, but when you look back with hindsight, you realise how important it was. You know, so he throws one of these things in and says, for just as no sign. So it's an evil, adulterous generation that seeks after a sign, but no sign is going to be given unless it's the sign of Jonah the prophet. For just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. So the throwaway is here's Jonah. Jonah is a prophet from Galilee. Probably, as I said, Jesus is relocated up in Galilee because of what comes next is by the sea, even though we started down in Jerusalem. And he throws this sign in. Well, what's the sign of Jonah? Well, obviously, as Jesus is going to allude to, people got saved by the preaching of Jonah without the context of the law. They just heard it and repented. They had an instinct that there was something in what he had said that challenged them with a kind of a weight of authority and grace in it that actually caused a change in who they were. But as we look back on the story, the thing, of course, every kid knows is the sign of Jonah is he got swallowed by a whale. So just as Jonah was in the belly of a whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. And here we have a form of speaking going on rather than literal. Although you will, I regularly in my reading, you will encounter people who desperately want to make the crucifixion happen. I think on the Wednesday or the Thursday, because they see this and say, well, Jesus wasn't. You know, when we look at the crucifixion and resurrection story, he wasn't in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. You know. He was in there for 2 nights, so Friday night to Saturday night, Sunday night to Monday night, and actually that just about covers 1 day and 2 bits of a day, and so they want to kind of stretch out the period. The problem with that is it then contradicts when Jesus said about rising on the third day. Didn't he say to us he would rise on the third day? And the logic of the third day is much more attested to in the New Testament as to being the significant thing that the disciples remembered. So you've got these two things that kind of sit in contradiction. And you do, if you go and look, you do see clever ways that people have of trying to make the two fit. But I don't think we need to actually be too clever. One is a sort of is a way of speaking and emphasizing something in a similar way to when we talk about and so is 6 feet under. We mean they're dead and buried, and the fact that the burial ground isn't necessarily or the coffin isn't exactly 6 feet under the surface is neither here nor there. It's a way of kind of drawing the thing together. So and equally, there is also a kind of a sense when you're looking to apply it that the very thing we're talking about, being in the heart of the earth, we think about is the descent of Jesus, which in one sense is an eternal thing rather than a historical thing. So it's a period of time, a continuous period of time that has eternal significance. So it's not necessarily that we have to kind of make it precisely fit in terms of a chronological sense. So this is one of those little phrases or little things that you will regularly hear if you talk with a Muslim evangelist. They will often use this, you see, as Jesus got it wrong. Because is it 3 days and 3 nights or is it on the third day? It's never really struck me, and I have to just say it's partly, I guess, because of the way I was brought up to understand and read the Bible as being a big, strong argument. But it's worth mentioning because for a lot of people it causes some consternation. So Jesus takes a story, and he takes the story of Jonah, and just to kind of get across within the rabbis of Jesus's day. Lots of the Old Testament is treated very symbolically rather than literally. Now, I'm not saying that they are right or wrong. What I'm saying is in the context, the thing that everybody could agree on was on the sort of symbolic meaning. So Philo, who is a philosopher, Jewish philosopher living in Alexandria, wrote a complete commentary of the Old Testament, or he writes his notes on the Old Testament, I should say. I don't know if it's a complete commentary. So for instance, he treats the days of Genesis in the beginning not as 24-hour days. But interesting, when he comes to Jonah, he does see the fish experience as having some proper event in history that's related to it. So that's significant. So I treat the fish story significantly, but to understand that within the kind of the mix of things, the thing is an image, and Jesus is using it as an image, and even within the image side, whether Jonah actually goes down into the fish's gullet is ambiguous, because the kind of the Hebrew and the Greek is a little bit more open. So here in the Greek, just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale, the word is more like the hollow, but the hollow in your stomach is your belly, so that's why we translate it that way, the hollow. But equally, if you look at a blue whale or whatever, it has an enormous sac in its mouth, it's a big open thing there. So I tend, rather than actually going right the way into the gullet with all the stomach juices and so on, and of course Jonah pens a prayer when he's there. He doesn't write it down when he's there. He prays something and then records it for us later, while he's in that kind of situation. So it's more a sense of here is a prophet. He's in a drowning situation. He's going down into the deep. There is a great sea creature that comes, maybe he's into the mouth, somehow or other it gets him to shore and he's spat up. And we have this then, the 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale is symbolic of being truly dead and buried, truly gone. There's no hope of resurrection at this point. It's absolutely there. And Jesus just uses it in the same way. So hopefully that's not feeling too kind of fudgy by me in saying that. I'm having to address it because it's there, and it sometimes gets thrown at us. And at the same time, it doesn't feel necessarily to me like a big issue. So hopefully that's good enough in explaining it. to everyone. So let's come back and move on. Because then Jesus then pushes out the reason why he's raised this sign right now. Of course, the people originally hearing Jesus aren't thinking about Jesus' death and resurrection. They know nothing of it at this stage. It's with hindsight, we look back and see Jesus kind of preempting it, that he's going to achieve something like Jonah achieved something, and he's going to be like Jonah. He's going to have to go down into the depths, into death and into chaos. So the men of Nineveh will stand up on the judgment for this generation and condemn it, because they reconsidered at the preaching of Jonah. And look, or behold, something greater than Jonah is here. And then he talks about, and then the queen of the south will rise up in judgment for this generation and will condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And look, something greater than Solomon is here. And so again, we're getting this kind of the framework of what's the sign you're looking for. There are quite miraculous things going on. There is a reinterpretation of the law in a way that makes moral sense, makes kind of emotional sense, that you're judging it because you're trying to be very kind of literal and fixed about how exactly the law should work. So Jesus is kind of challenging that process, and you're missing the remarkable fruit that is here, because if in your mind it's not perfect and not happening the way it should. And so he talks about that there are those who see far less, and of course that's true today, but it's a hope that they want to cling on to. Unfortunately for the crowds or the Pharisees and the rulers who are listening to Jesus, they have already founded their hope, but in something which they control. So this new hope is not a hope at all. It's an irritation. Oh yeah, okay, and then we get this kind of strange shift, which thematically, in Matthew, kind of works with what's gone before, but in terms of the immediate conversation, because Jesus suddenly goes back to the demonic, which, as I said, we've had a few verses before the release of a man from a demon. I mean, it's in that context that this conversation about, then has come up the issue of he casts out demons by the Lord of Demons and so on. Those things have come up. Then we've had this sign issue, which is it's not enough. And then we're going back to the issue of the demonic. And it's kind of like Matthew is now concluding that process. So coming back to this issue, which they've just seen, where a man has been released from a mute, deaf, dumb and mute spirit and so on, Jesus kind of uses that in a way which is there as a kind of a warning into this situation. So now the unclean spirit, when it's gone out from the man, it passes through waterless places seeking rest, but it doesn't find it. Then it says, I'll return to my house from where I came, and having come, it finds it unoccupied, but swept and put in order. And of course, in the mix of this, there's something about the adequacy of what Jesus is about to do that's probably at play here. Jesus has challenged, which we looked at last week. He's challenged the Pharisees that if I'm casting out demons by the prince of demons, then who do your kids do it by, or who do your sons do it by? In other words, exorcism is a part of the kind of Jewish religious community, and Jesus is drawing to them drawing attention to them that very often probably in their experience, they have dealt with someone in a kind of a place of torment and madness. They've seen the person get better, but actually then again later on it gets worse. And for those who are involved in those types of ministries, we understand that is not uncommon, that very often something happens at an immediate level, but the root doesn't get removed. And what Jesus then is kind of drawing their attention to is something that they know by experience. They dealt with it, they say the right words, they pray the right prayer, there's a kind of a level of grace, there's something breaks in, someone who's released, they find some sanity of mind. But then some months later, suddenly we find the person is back and often worse than where they were. So Jesus kind of is just illustrating that, as he kind of says, it's a bit like, if you've chucked someone out of the house who's wrecking it, actually after a while, he'll go back and finding it unoccupied. And so again, we have here a little bit of teaching, which in its context makes less sense than when we look back on it. Because Jesus is going to unpack for his disciples that the Comforter who is to come, the Spirit who is to come, who is going to indwell them. And that's a new kind of theological idea. So the Spirit may be, and the grace of God, the Spirit is with them, and he's sometimes with the sons of the Pharisees and the leaders of the synagogue, and they do things, but often it's temporary. And the reason it's temporary is because there's something missing. And of course, in the context of where Jesus is going to teach his disciples, although he doesn't do it immediately here, it is the place of the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit that gives us more confidence that we've not just dealt with the person's demonization in the moment, but actually it can be secured and made safe and so on by the work and the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit. So I in terms of the verse 45, I rather than using the word evil, the word that's used in the Greek is a kind of corrupting actions. It's actions that make evil rather than being something that's essentially evil. So it's not evil by nature, it's an evil by action. So I've gone for the word corrosive and corrupting rather than evil, just because I quite like to throw in words that aren't expected when we're doing these Bible studies. So it then goes and takes 7 other spirits with it, more corrosive than itself, and going in, they live there, and the final state of the man is worse than the first. And so it will be with this corrupting generation. That there's something that God has done. He's acted time and time again into the history of Israel. He's driven out the demonic. He's actually put the house in order, and then you leave it for a bit, and suddenly it's back and worse than it was. And actually, if you can think of most of Jewish history or Israeli history, even before that, as being a process like that. God acts, he does something, he produces order, things are going well for a generation or so, and then things start to go downhill and it gets worse. And then someone comes along, a reformer like an Ezra or a Jeremiah, and they try to draw something together, and maybe they have some partial success, but you leave it a few more generations and it's falling apart again. And so Jesus is in one sense setting us up to anticipate something that natural cycle, which we don't see none of in Christendom, but actually it has something working with it, because there is always this hope that in some of those places that Christendom has cleared out the demonic from, actually get fully indwelt by the presence of the Holy Spirit, and they're held on to, and they're never lost. And so process by process, progress is made, and by the if you like, the securing presence of the Holy Spirit. And then, just in Matthew's kind of habit of jumping from thing to thing, suddenly we touch a real event. This is, sorry, it sounds terrible. It sounds like I'm saying some events aren't real. What I mean is, in contrast to what I was saying at the beginning about how sometimes Matthew joins things together thematically, but actually as part of this process, which while it started in the south, seems to have moved by the end of this to the north. And it makes sense there that then what happens is we hear about his brothers and his mother trying to find him. And so we move on to now see, while he was speaking to the crowds, his mother and his brothers were standing outside wanting to speak to him. Well, this makes sense if they've got back now to Galilee. So someone told him, look, your mother and brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you. But he answered the speaker, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And I'm going to skim past this without too much comment, because I want to come on to the last little bit. And gesturing with his hand towards his disciples, he said, see, my brother and my brothers. Sometimes, when I read it, I remember as a kid, when I first read these, you think, oh, that's a bit rude to his mum and his brothers, but he's not necessarily directly speaking to them right here. What he's saying is, actually, you are my family. And that's given context when he says, so whoever does the will of my Father. Okay, so there is something about our obedience to the revelation of God and his fatherhood. Then actually that makes you my brothers. And then Jesus adds this extra word, and sister and mother. And perhaps I'm reading too much into this. But I do notice there is a transition as we go through Jesus's ministry, where the women who start to follow him in Galilee actually start to step into the place where they are treated like disciples. And if we think about the latter part of Jesus's teaching, he is teaching to his disciples in parables. Sometimes he contrasts a male-centric or male-focused parable with a female-focused one. So like the lost sheep, okay, shepherds and men, and the woman with her lost coin, which is a very, very female relevant issue. Her marriage, the wealth is related to her in terms of the gifts that are made at her wedding, which actually, if she was to be divorced, she keeps. So actually, these are things of real importance as women's concerns, if you like. Think of it like that. And we have much more dialogue around the women. We have Jesus relating to Mary and Martha is sitting at his feet, and we're seeing her now in that discipleship role. So there is a kind of a growing revelation or transition of experience, and of course, eventually, the very first apostle of the resurrection is going to be the women, or it's going to be a woman, Mary Magdalene, and more generally, the group of women who are commissioned by Jesus. So therefore, they're apostle. They're sent out to speak to the disciples. And so it's not kind of written in large on the text, but I can't help notice it because the question is always put in terms of your mother and your brothers, your mother and your brothers. But in the response, as Jesus now indicates his disciples, he includes the women who are standing there, who have been following him. And it's perhaps, if you like, the first indication of this step where we start to see them operating more in the role of disciples than just simply followers, if that makes sense. So I thought that was a nice way of perhaps finishing the kind of the text today, to highlight that. It's been a little bit kind of up and down because of the strange thing. I've obviously run out of space on my hard drive, which definitely threw me at the beginning. But does anyone want to ask any questions or make any comments? I suspect there will be, because I think there's that it's a that issue of 3 days and 3 nights is sometimes confusing for folks. Anyone like to ask anything?
I don't think I've seen this before somehow, but just interested in the connection of the belly of the whale and the heart of the earth.
Yeah.
In terms of parts of the body. I don't think it had ever struck me. Heart of the earth just felt like a sort of
So the
phrase, but
word, although it's based on the root word for a space or a hollow, but it's actually used often euphemistically for all of the insides, for the insides
okay.
of.
Mm,
So although it's the actual word is hollow, like the stomach is often hollow, but that's what I'm saying. Actually, also equally,
mm,
the gullet of a whale is also part of that same
mm,
space.
mm,
But actually, you're absolutely right. I think it's clear in the Greek, but it wouldn't be justifiable to say into the heart of the. Well, maybe it would. It's basically the going inside and the heart.
mm,
So if you actually look up the word, I can't remember what it is in Strong's. It will talk about the heart and the inward parts after it's talked about the space, the kind of the whole bit that it's sometimes used of all those things, and actually the heart of the earth. It's going right into the.
mm.
So.
Yeah, no, it just interested me. I hadn't really seen it before. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Barbara. Oh, and welcome, Mike. I didn't notice you at the beginning. Any other questions or anything anyone would like to ask about? As I say, you get the impression from me that my favourite is spotting that reference, the inclusion. Jesus gestures towards those around him and then refers to referring to his disciples, and then talking about my brothers and my sisters. So all kind of drawing them together there. So that first little hint. No one wants to ask or comment on anything. So, oh well, there you go. So it may well be that that there won't be a really good, clear video recording of this when we finish, but there'll be the one that we can get from the live stream, which is never quite such high quality because it's being streamed live, but that will be there in a couple of days. Well, no, sorry, it won't be there in a couple of days. It will be instantly available. If you want to, for anyone who's watching after the event. Good. Well, okay. So it's felt a bit chaotic to me today, but I guess you're going to have days like that when the technology messes you around.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's very good. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for being here. We'll get a few more in before we break for summer. Let's see see if we can get through all of Matthew 13. I don't know. We'll see. Okay then, guys. Well, I will say goodbye and bless you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much,
Very
Kristen.
interesting.
Thanks very much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Bye.